Good evening there, and welcome to another edition of Unlock the Door Radio with your host, Michael Cross, here with hopefully an hour of interesting analysis of news and events. Now, speaking of news and events, what I would like to deal with today is a subject that I find very interesting, and that is media and its influence on people. And I think most listeners are very aware of how the media is manipulated, how it's concentrated, and so forth, and how a message can change just slightly using a different word, different context, and you can change everything in the story. So what I'm going to do is design this in such a way that we go over how really the media affects the human mind. And I'd like to start with the first few minutes. I'd like to start with how the media got to where it is in the first place in modern culture, and then jump to how reporting takes place and how it changes people's perception of the reality, and maybe explain why people in one country have a totally different sense of reality, a different perception of what's going on in the world than people in another country, even though both might be very educated, very analytical people. So let's go ahead and start this here with the concept of how did we get to where we are now and where we're heading. Now, the thing is, in the old days, and what I mean by old is I actually mean ancient. If we go back to any of the ancient civilizations, Sumeria, Greece, Egypt, and then, of course, the Mesoamerican cultures of the Incans, the Aztec, and the Maya, and so forth, we find something very common in all of them, and that is that the average person was not literate. They may have had very literate, very knowledgeable upper classes, whether those upper classes were upper class in regards to their title in the royalty, or whether they were upper class in regards to their titles in religion. But these were the people that had all the knowledge, and these were the people who could dictate what message got out to their people. And often what they would do in their culture is they would have scribes. Let's say we have Egypt, and they would have scribes who knew how to read, and then they would be given information that was to go out to the various governors, and then the governors would then, and other magistrates and so forth, would then give information out to the local populations whenever that was necessary. And that held the society together. But people had to have a great deal of trust in their leaders. In fact, if we look at China, if we look at Japan, we look at Egypt, and even to a certain degree in Europe, royal families have often said that they're descended from a mixture of divine beings and humans, and that gave them a certain legitimacy. And of course, as many of you know, one of the stipulations that the peace accords after World War II called for, America forced on Japan, was that Emperor Hirohito had to renounce his divinity and just become just a regular guy who happened to be a emperor or king or whatever. And whereas most Americans would think that was kind of funny, that if you look at the histories of civilizations, that was fairly common. But anyway, that gave them legitimacy. And this is how they controlled. They would use, like I'd say, religion. The priest would know when a lunar eclipse was going to take place, or when a solar eclipse was going to take place, or other astronomical events. And when the people saw that, they would predict that 3 o'clock the moon will cover the sun and it'll get dark. Well, the people are going, wow, that is amazing. These priests know, the secrets of the universe. And it's actually kind of funny, although it's a topic of a different show, that religion often revolved around the idea of a certain ladder of ascent. You had the general members of a religion, and then they would go through various stages to get to kind of an enlightened core. And that enlightened core would have knowledge of science and mathematics as well as religion. And although it might make some Christians uncomfortable, that's the way it was for Christianity back in the ancient days as well. Although everyone has this idea of a very egalitarian religious system, it wasn't. It was one in which you were given information as you grew. And even in the New Testament, when Jesus was around, he talked in parables, and then he would tell his followers, well, at your stage, you know what the parable's about, but the other people don't. So, yeah, there was some, you could say there was some elitism there. But anyway, that's beside the point. The thing is that in all these ancient cultures, a very small percentage of people knew a lot. They knew how things operated. They knew how the world operated, and they held on to that very tightly. And then later, if we go into Europe, the Catholic Church held on to things very tightly. You could not translate a Bible from Latin into the native language for quite some time, and there was some pretty nasty consequences if you did. You were labeled a heretic, and of course we know that when the government and the religion were working hand in hand, that could be very bad news to get labeled a heretic. Part of the changes of that, though, happened to deal with, well, of all things, the plague. Because the plague wiped out a large proportion of the population. This necessitated finding ways to save labor to produce goods. When that happened, it set the stage for the Industrial Revolution. When the Industrial Revolution took place, and you needed not only raw materials in greater abundance, you also needed to have new markets to sell those products to. Then we wound up with a merchant class. The merchant class wanted to have the skills of literacy because in many cases they wound up becoming as important and as rich as the kings and other nobles within the society. So they wanted essentially knowledge. You can't be a very good merchant if you don't know how to use mathematics, in many cases navigation, and of course know how to do business. So this necessitated increased literacy. And so what happened is that as their influence grew, they not only demanded more reform, but they were tired of the old system that held them down, that kept the feudal hierarchy in place. And thus, you'll find that when Martin Luther was doing his protest, the people that really got things going was the merchant class. They funded him. So essentially, he was someone being funded by bankers, by tradesmen, and other knowledgeable people. And of course, this created a huge schism in Christianity in Europe, but it also set the stage for more innovation, because when those hierarchies were knocked down, the British, primarily the British at the time, at least initially, were starting to use more and more science and acquisition of new ways to do things in order to advance the country and themselves. Now, of course, it may have been amongst the wealthiest people, but it had a way of expanding from the top down, in which you didn't just have a small, tiny number of people who knew how to read and write and also have any kind of wealth, but it started growing to where you had the beginnings of the middle class. Now, of course, this was all facilitated by the invention of the Gutenberg press, in which, of course, everyone knows about the Gutenberg Bible, which was printed off, and how that revolutionized things, because you no longer needed a scribe to copy a Bible, and then, it might take him months to actually write a copy of the Bible down. The mass production meant that the price per Bible went down, and then more and more common people had it, and not just within Latin, but also in their own language. This created at least the stages for the Enlightenment. And eventually that would lead to such things as, well, we look with the Puritans. Of course, with the Enlightenment, we did have a lot of revolutions and social unrest and so forth. That happens when people become more educated. But when the Puritans broke away from the Church of England because they wanted something purer, they also stressed education. They felt that all people should be able to read a Bible by the age of 5. And so they really stressed literacy. And of course, they set up some of the major universities, Harvard and Yale and so forth. And, initially in order to be able to promote this literacy and also spread the word of God. This was when, things weren't so secular. They were more sectarian. And at one time, the Puritans reached the level of almost full literacy. They were the most literate people on earth. Okay, so that was a pretty major accomplishment. But also, when you're the most literate people when it came to reading the Bible, that also meant that literacy could transcend into other areas, into the sciences, into philosophy, into any number of fields that we take for granted today that were once reserved only for a very privileged few. Writing and the very first stages of a media that could reach a region of what we now would call a country was pretty revolutionary. And as it grew, and we go into, for instance, the 1700s, it would lead to people questioning even the divine right of kings. And people could write treatises, and they could send out pamphlets like Thomas Paine was doing, and Benjamin Franklin with his little newspaper, and so forth, to reach the masses with ideas. And ideas are what's important ultimately in any society. A literate society that is a thinking society is one in which things are possible, where there are no limits. A society where you have illiteracy, people are pretty much just going to be concerned with their own survival and what's going on within their own household, and not with what's going on in their community or even the world. Now, of course, we see how things changed with, for instance, the era of the American Revolution, and to a certain degree the French Revolution, where people were able to get information out to the masses. Plus, we had people living in cities, in more concentrated cities, because we had factories and businesses that were associated with those factories and the trade and so forth. So, things happen. Kings got overthrown. England got kicked out of the United States, of course, with a lot of help from the French financing it. And then, the French paid so much money to do that helped to facilitate their revolution, which was far more bloody than the American Revolution. But nevertheless, it would not have been possible without literacy. People like Robespierre and so forth promoting their ideas amongst educated middle-income type people. Revolutions occur amongst middle class. They don't occur amongst the poor. Check it out. I mean, poor people might join in, but more as the foot soldiers, not the leaders. So anyway, what did we have back in, like, for instance, after the Revolutionary War up until maybe the end of the 19th century? Well, for one thing, we had a situation in which we had communities in which anyone that could afford a press could, one of those old-fashioned presses, could make a newspaper, and many people did. Just like nowadays, people can go on and blog information and reach whatever audience they are able to attract to their blog. In those days, you might have a community with only, 300 or 400 houses, but it would have 7 or 8 newspapers. By the way, that makes historical research very difficult, because all those newspapers were like the alternative press is today on the internet. They all had their various views, and they could be very subjective in how they presented the news. But anyway, you had this very fluid atmosphere, and you had a lot of people exploring what was going on and how things could change and so forth. Now, and also appealing to their various tastes. Some things were more highbrow, some things were more to the common man. But nevertheless, in this atmosphere, especially after, the influence of religious schools, but also of the reform movement, which promoted the idea of public schools, pretty much a common factory worker knew how to read. So anyway, then we get into such things as in major cities, just like we will see in the 1980s, and I'll go over that. You had a concentration starting to take place where newspapers would merge, where instead of maybe a city of 20,000 people had like 300 newspapers, you might wind up in a few years with 30 newspapers, and then later with 5 newspapers. And so usually they would use a model that would attract the most people in their demographic segment, people that they were looking for. If you're trying to reach the working class man, or maybe you were trying to attract people that were more into literacy, literary stuff, and culture and so forth. Now, what later would occur, though, is something that would revolutionize everything. First of all was the telegraph. You could get news from one source to another instantaneously. A little bit of Morse code knowledge, and all of a sudden you are reaching, you could send a message from New York to, Los Angeles or San Diego in just a matter of seconds once all the telegraph wires were up. That was very revolutionary. And it's part of the reason why the Union was able to beat the Southerners in the Civil War, was because their communication structure was so much better, because the North was more industrial, whereas the South was more agrarian. And, an industrial center had more communication through telegraph and more telegraph lines and so forth. Then what would later occur that would change everything is you had the laying of the transatlantic cable, which enabled communication between Europe and the United States. Now, of course, there was a lot of things that took place around that helped get America into World War I, especially when the British were able to destroy the cable that connected from Germany to the United States. So then the British were the only ones getting their version of the events of when the war broke out to the American press and ultimately to the public. So this is where propaganda became more and more important. By the way, propaganda, I gotta say this, propaganda is merely something that's designed to get people to be persuaded from one view to another. It can be true, but often it can be somewhat misleading, and we'll get into that in a few minutes. Sometimes what you don't tell people is more important than what you do tell people, and that's where propaganda gets its power. And then you got someone like Edward Bernays, who, again, I've dealt with Edward Bernays before. In fact, if you want to, you can check up a video I did on him called Edward Bernays, Architect of the Consumer Mind. It's out there on YouTube, and very interesting individual. But what he was able to do was he was the nephew and also cousin of Sigmund Freud, the psychologist. And Sigmund Freud was the one who determined that human beings were governed not by rational thought, where we look at abstract concepts, compare them, and then come up with the best solution. They are ultimately determined by instincts, sex, survival, fitting in, and so forth. And then all those things that we call civilization are just the expression of our trying to survive amongst each other and try to ignore those various instincts. And so ultimately it was Bernays who found out the power of the cigarette because of its shape and how it related to phallic symbol and sexuality and to the penis and so forth. And then, of course, he sold the idea of he was working for the tobacco industry, and And because of, back to the Industrial Revolution, the thing was that now you could produce things like cigarettes in mass quantities, and you had to find new markets for these things that you could produce at a huge rate, in huge volumes, and make more money if you were able to find markets for it. Women weren't smoking in the United States, so Bernays was ultimately, he was the one who turned feminism into a marketable good, because he was able to he had women at a parade pull out cigarettes and start smoking them. Very big taboo, but he'd already alerted the press that something big was going to happen with these women. So they were all there. They report this like scandalous thing, and once it went out to the public, women were like, "Yeah, I want to be free too. I want to have the power of a man," and they started smoking cigarettes. And of course, he used the new technology of the movie screen, and he made deals with the the directors, to make sure that the leading women, and men too, were shown smoking, and showing it as glamorous and upper class. And the people that era in the United States and later Europe, they were only first generation off the farm. Most of them had not grown, they were born first generation in the cities, or maybe they had actually been born on the farm and moved into the cities. And people have this idea of, I want to be like the rich people. I want to be like the sophisticated people. That has not changed all the way from ancient Egypt to modern 2015. People want to copy the rich and what their customs are, what their manners are, and so forth. Believe me, Bernays is the one who said that our interest, our mannerisms, our beliefs are all dictated by people, a very small number of people that we've never heard of, and we're unaware of it. And you could ask yourself, why do most people have a certain haircut in the 70s, but then they have a certain haircut now in 2015? Is it because everyone suddenly decided, hey everyone, maybe we should have our hair like this? No, it's the influence of media. Okay, it's the influence. Lots of things out there have changed people's styles and how they want to present themselves and so forth. And you could use the media, according to Bernays, to change people's attitudes on everything. It's only been in the last few years. And you see commercials on TV in the United States showing men in the shower shaving their chest. I mean, in the 1950s, having a big, muscles and a hairy chest was considered sexy. Nowadays, you don't see so much hair on men's chest anymore. In fact, you can actually see in movies at which the leading star was in movies in the 90s, and then he's in movies now. And hey, what happened to his chest hair? Because it's a change in what we perceive as being desirable. It's what's promoted, and so forth. So, full body shaving for women started ultimately, and of course it has some other influences as well, but ultimately it started when the lingerie industry started going more mainstream in the United States. So that necessitated hair removal, and thus, styles that, I don't think suddenly people, men and women in the late 80s suddenly started saying, hey, I want this kind of, lacy underwear and so forth. Okay? It was something that was marketed. And then it was like, hey, that's cool. And then it became part of the society and is now totally mainstream. Because you wouldn't have had these lingerie stores in regular everyday malls back in 1975. That would have been considered scandalous. Now, you can't have a mall without having one of the big chains out there. And so forth. So this is what Bernays was talking about when he was saying that our values are dictated by a small number of people, ultimately marketers. He was one of them. And the more that the media became far-reaching, the more power these people have, whether it be politicians that consult public relations experts, or whether it be the public relations experts themselves. And when radio came into being, when movies became something that everyone wanted to go see, and later with television coming into the game, this allowed leaders of countries, leaders of industry, and so forth, advertisers, to reach millions upon millions upon millions of people. And it's interesting. It's changed everything about us. If you look at the United States, I've watched videos that were recordings, films of people being interviewed in the Appalachian Mountains back in the 1930s and 40s. I can barely understand a word they're saying. Okay? But after years of radio, after years of TV, those local dialects have been pretty much obliterated. Yeah, sure, people might still talk a little bit like this, but what their grandparents were talking is hardly understandable, because we wind up with, like in the United States, the language that is considered the news language is West Coast, Oregon, Washington, and California coastal accent. That's what people are trained in when they do the news nationally, and also local stations too. They're trained. If they have an accent that is different, they learn to get rid of it. And of course, when people hear that all the time, it becomes more the national language. Same is true in places like Germany, where the northern peoples versus the Bavarians could barely understand each other. Sweden, where the local dialects from the far south and the north were totally different. Radio and television brought more of a unification of the culture ultimately, and also gave more power to leaders such as FDR, Hitler, Churchill, Stalin. All of them used these new technologies to reach more and more people with their message. And when they had that power, that gave them intense influence, where you could be living in Vladivostok or you could be living in St. Petersburg, and still Stalin gets on with a speech. You could be living in Munich, or you could be living in even Austria after Hitler took over, and even before he took over, and still on the radio you could hear Hitler speaking. You could be in America during the Great Depression, and Franklin Roosevelt with his weekly firesides trying to kind of boost everyone's morale, and hey, we're going to get through this and everything's going to be fine. He could be listened to in Maine, or he could be listened to in San Francisco, California, and that created a great unity. So everyone in America knew who Franklin Roosevelt is. And that was only possible with the technologies that had come in. Later, television would also bring in a lot of uniformity as well. But before I deal with TV, let's go back to the movie industry. The movies, there was it Marlon Brando? He may have been, may not have been, but anyway, he was in a movie where he was wearing a T-shirt. And in the early 50s, T-shirts were considered a little risque for guys to wear in public. Okay, you may see pictures of men working on an airplane during World War II on a hot beach, in Saipan or someplace like that. But it was just around a lot of guys, and it was okay to do. But if you were in public, wearing a T-shirt was like going out in your underwear. Yeah, you're still covering everything that still needs to be covered, but it's kind of like weird. So, but when women saw Marlon Brando wearing this T-shirt, they wanted their husbands to look like that too. Maybe their husbands, didn't look like Marlon Brando. He might have been short and bald and fat. But hey, you get a T-shirt, and kind of got that image going on. And the same was true of like this new book. Well, it's not new anymore, but the movie is 50 Shades of Grey. A couple of years ago, you could not stock enough gray ties in New York and in London, because so many of the women readers of that book, their husband might not tie them down and spank them. Their husband might not look like, the guy that's in the movie now, and he probably was not a billionaire, but by golly, if he could wear that tie, he would look the part. So then you could live that little fantasy, and that's all ultimately that television and movies are based on, is a fantasy. And that's what, and that's how advertising goes about, how it's evolved in American society, and now Western society, and now all societies around the earth. My gosh, I was in China. Whew, talk about advertising and modern methods of getting the information out to people. Very impressive when you visit Beijing. People may say China's communist, but they sure know how to run business. And it's beautiful. I'd recommend people visiting China. It's really an interesting experience. And the skyline of Beijing looks like something from a science fiction movie. It's such modern architecture, unbelievable. But anyway, the thing that's kind of interesting is that marketing has a feedback loop involved with it. First, you've got to find out what people like, okay? And then you've got to find out how you can sell them something. And then that changes because you've got to, of course, have variety when you have competition out there. So then you've got to turn around and find ways to change your product ever so slightly, improve it, make it a different color, do all these other things, and eventually you wind up with changing the culture altogether. I remember the first time I ever went to Sweden, and that was in 1999, and you could pretty much get three flavors of ice cream: vanilla, chocolate, or strawberry. Now, of course, I was used to the United States, where you go through the ice cream stands at any of your supermarkets, and it was like hundreds of different flavors. Some of the ice cream that was more candy than it was ice cream, and so forth. And, of course, a standard vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry. But there's a huge choice. And things have changed, though, in Sweden. Now there's a lot more variety, not as much as the United States, but there's a heck of a lot more variety. And eventually I think that you will see a store in Sweden in 10 years will have the same variety as you do in the United States, because the media still connects to people. So if someone hears something about a soft drink like Mountain Dew, which you used to not be able to buy in Sweden, but they see it placed in a movie, the lead star, say, I could sure use a Mountain Dew right now. And, they're drinking Mountain Dew. Then you get curious. And then, of course, when they test market it, people are like, hey, I've heard of Mountain Dew. I've heard it's pretty good. And then they go out and they buy it. And then you have a demand for it. And then pretty soon you're going to have commercials on Swedish TV selling Mountain Dew. And pretty soon it'll be something that people will just take for granted that that's something you can buy in Sweden. And that's how marketing actually works with media. Now, when it comes to the media, though, with movies, you can change values. People start seeing the way people act, what the norms are, and so forth. We had a different standard of beauty and family life in the 1950s. And that was reinforced by the media. You never showed a husband and wife sleeping in the same bed. You never saw them, having a long make-out kiss or something like that. You had the children respectful to their parents. You had, generally, kind of interesting, you usually had the leading man being about, 10, 15, 20 years older than the leading woman. And the women, by today's standards, they were plump. But in that era, there was less emphasis on, a woman looking like an anorexic 14-year-old boy. But the thing is that those were reinforced values. Now, there were changes that were slowly introduced into the society, but ultimately it was a slow process until the 1960s, in which you had kind of a social movement that started questioning corporatism and the powers that be. Then it became fashionable to start, doing new things with movies. And with the advent of things going on in Europe, in fact, Sweden had a major influence on the motion picture industry in the United States. Noticed that in Sweden, they started showing nudity in movies. And they were kind of getting tired of the censorship boards. So you know what they did? Now, most people don't understand this. They wanted to be able to show nudity and more violence and deal with more disturbing themes in movies. So what they proposed, and this was not from the government. Most people think, the things about G and PG and R movies and X movies back in those days, and now NC-17, was to protect the kids. Actually, ultimately, no. It was to protect the theaters, the movie industry. because what the movie industry wanted to do was be able to compete at the same footing as films from other countries. That it was still, there was an interconnectedness, and they were worried about competition from these countries. So therefore, they wanted to be able to do these things in their movies. So they pressured the government to set up this rating system. And of course, their justification was, we don't want kids watching all that violence and nudity. So what we'll do is we'll make it to where if a parent's okay with it, then they can take their kids to go see the movie, but we'll give it an R rating. Kid can't go alone, but if mom or dad goes with them, it's okay, because some parents don't mind. But if it's X, or what now is called NC-17, no way, dude, they're not going to go watch it. That will be illegal. But the way we can show anything in those movies. In PG, it's like, there's something might be a little naughty in there, so parents should think about it. And in G, of course, take the whole family, grandma and the family pets, and go see the movie, and no one's going to be offended, especially the dogs and cats that you might take with you to the movie. But the thing is that it was set up for their benefit, the movie industry itself. And then when that went into effect, they were able to diversify and show more things. And in the 60s, when they were able to do that, then you could deal with really controversial issues that question the morality of the system, the economics, the basic values of America were questioned in the 60s. And that changed, that had a fundamental shift in things. It helped to accelerate the sexual revolution, along with the birth control pill coming in at the same time. It caused a great deal of social change when it came to people's ideals in regards to marriage and family, work, and all these things. Because your new model for living was an actor or actress on the big screen. And later, of course, and in those days, what happened was you had the TV shows that were primarily live. But then later, it was that when a movie had played out its full life in the movies and no one wanted to pay to go see it anymore, then it would be transferred, it'd be edited and then shown on TV. And there wasn't any DVDs in those days and so forth. But all of these things work together to solidify the culture, but also change the culture. At the same time, or I should say just a little bit later, you had an increasing concentration of media power, in which big newspapers and so forth became the rule. Where in a city you would have one newspaper that was pretty much what you considered the city newspaper. You might have some little tiny alternative newspapers, but one big newspaper in one city. Now there were some rules initially in the 70s that said no one company could own one newspaper and one TV station in the same community. That was considered, it's a little bit kind of not allowing enough variety when it came to information. And then in the United States, under Reagan and later under Clinton, these regulations were pulled. And then suddenly you saw, this newspaper bought by this TV corporation, or this corporation buys these TV corporations and so forth. Now we're left with about 6 major, massive entertainment and media and news corporations, massive ones, and everything's filtered through these companies. Now, then we get into the whole idea, though, of do we really have a lot of variety now in the United States and in Europe or anywhere ultimately? I'm not just saying. I'm not going to just make it sound like America and Europe are in some way controlled. I'm just saying that traditionally we used to think of America and Europe as having a wide variety of news sources and information sources competing with each other in order ultimately to allow us to see the truth. And we associate, of course, other nations as not having that. But in recent years, that power has become so concentrated that might not be so true anymore. We can't just say America and Europe are different. Maybe we become more like some of the countries we used to say didn't have a lot of variety in information. I mean, true, In the in the old days, it's still you were required to have some money in order to have a printing press. Later, you needed even more money if you wanted a radio station, and even more money and investment if you wanted to put something on TV. But nowadays, to compete with the big guys on the block, that's very difficult. Now, the internet's doing it, of course. I'm wondering how long that's going to last in its current free form. But I think ultimately you can see that power is becoming more and more concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. And I would, a lot of people say that's the 1% of the 1% control what the 99% listen to and read and watch on TV and the news and so forth. But if you are, most of us have to rely to a certain degree on what comes out in the press, even if you're dealing with alternative media under today's American oligopoly system. It's not a monopoly. We don't have just one company. We've got 5 or 6. That's an oligopoly. And then we need to start asking things about how do we determine what we're looking at is actually accurate. And maybe not so much for the people that listen to the alternative press, but mostly the people who are interested in, maybe we have friends and family and so forth that, maybe give them a little information. Now, let's take a look at something here that you should maybe consider. Chomsky's talked about this. He's talked about, saying that there's not like this super conspiracy that's controlling everything that you read and write, but it's a circle of influence. And that is the people that put on most of the news and the big name newspapers and so forth, and pretty much our information industry. They go to the same schools. They come from the same social class. They have the same likes and dislikes. I don't think very many of them go to rodeos as entertainment. I don't think very many of them go to, hippie festivals like the Oregon Country Fair. They don't seem to be the kind of people that you'll catch going to things like that, or to some sort of crafts fair in Junction City, Oregon, or something like that. I don't think you're going to see that. These people are generally urban. They go to schools that, might cost more in tuition than the average person might earn in 5 or 10 years of working. And so they have a certain way of seeing the world. And so the first thing you have to ask is, what stories are played? Okay, the thing is that you're going to have, for instance, what's reported and what isn't. And that's a major thing. When it comes to what we see on the news, most people in the Western world believe that if it's important, it's on the news. If it's not important or lesser importance, it won't be on the news. And that is actually not the case. But that's the perception. If you go to someone who is especially older generation and you say, hey, have you heard about the new trade deal that's being worked out between America and Pacific Rim nations, or the one going on, the trade talks between the United States and the European Union? They're going to look at you kind of blankly because that's not in the mainstream press, and they're going to be going, that must not be very important. No, but did you hear that the Lakers are going to have a really good season this year? Well, there's more stories about the football, baseball, basketball than there are about, trade talks that may affect their job. But of course, if they do lose their job because of something in regards to a trade treaty, then they're not going to probably blame the treaty. They're going to say that, oh, well, the Republicans caused me to lose my job, or the Democrats caused me to lose my job. That's the way that things are in America. You blame the party you don't like if you lose your job. And, as if they, it's more of a, and there too, the Republicans and Democrats are kind of an oligopoly in and of themselves. I think Bonnier is probably one of the best Democrats out there. Anyway, the thing is that the power to leave a story out and to ignore it is incredible, because you leave it out, people don't think about it. And it's very difficult unless you're ahead of a large public interest group or any kind of interest group to get your story out there and to get things going because, well, I've seen situations where you have a protest march, and that is true for both what you would consider right wing and left wing. I've seen it happen both ways, in which you have a protest march, let's say against GMO or something, and you get 10,000 people show up, and not one newspaper in that city or TV station covers it. Now that's amazing. But if it's not being covered, then the people that were at the protest march and the people that watched it when they drove by, yeah, it happened. And they're going, wow, that's a pretty big protest march. But Joe out in the suburbs who didn't see it, and everyone else, they're just watching right away. They're just watching whatever's on the news. And it's not part of the way they're thinking and so forth. So always, that's one big power in reporting is not just the stories that you see, but the stories that are kind of, no, that's not important. And who determines it? Is it the people that say it's not important, or is it the people that own the media? Second, the words that are used. I love how people will read a story and they don't think about the fact that you can change the words in a story and change the whole context. If I have a story, for instance, about if I call a lead, first of all, let's say if I have a story about a certain political leader, and let's say it is I don't know, Vladimir Putin, and in one story I say Vladimir Putin is considered one of the most masterful manipulators in politics today. Well, that gives you an impression of evil and bad and ooh, he's the bad guy. Whereas, and that's set in your mind as you read the story. Oh, I'm going to read about this bad guy. If on the other hand I say Vladimir Putin is one of the leading diplomatic people in the world today, then it changes it to positive. He's a leader. It's leadership. You know what? Leadership and manipulation mean the same thing. Sorry, it is getting people to do something that they normally wouldn't do. Okay? And sometimes we kind of mistakenly think that, well, manipulators doing things clandestinely and behind people's backs. You don't think a leader chooses their words carefully and determines when they're going to give a speech and where they're going to give a speech and under what circumstances, even what tie they're going to wear? Of course, all of these things are part of the equation. But again, leader versus manipulator, regime versus government. I've seen many cases where Assad in Syria, it's referred to as, well, he's, the Assad regime. Well, when I think of regime, personally, I think of people with guns who are, it's kind of a mafioso type government. If, on the other hand, I see a story and it says, that's emotionally. On the other hand, emotionally, if you say the Assad government, oh, things change completely. It's like if you say the Russian government or the Chinese government, people associate government with the government of their own country. They think of rules and laws and so forth. And people getting into power, at least subconsciously, through legitimate means. If, on the other hand, you say regime, the Chinese regime, the Russian regime, the Syrian regime, or I've heard some people in America, even whistleblowers who expose the NSA and the CIA, and they say the American government, the American regime. They use that purposely because they're trying to say that it is a regime. They want to bring up the negativity, even though government and regime mean the same thing. Pictures. Oh my gosh, that's where, you show a nasty picture of a politician, or you show a picture where they're smiling and shaking hands with people and everyone looks happy. Makes a huge difference. People's minds, most of them read one paragraph and look at the picture and then they go on. They don't read the full story. Most of us do that. We just read the head. Sometimes it's just read the headline, look at the story, and it's like, well, unless it's really, really, really important, we don't want to bother reading the whole story. So therefore, when we casually glide through, it's still stuck in our mind, the picture and the headline or the first couple sentences of the story. That's the story for 90% of people. So if I have a picture that shows Hillary Clinton with a nasty look on her face, That's the image that people get in their mind. Oh, she's mad all the time. If I show a picture of Hillary Clinton with a big smile on her face, or really happy, then you get this image of, oh, she seems to be such a nice person. But the problem is, you can make anyone look nasty. You can make anyone look wonderful in the way you portray the picture. On documentaries, you show someone walking slow, black and white, and you talk over them when they're up at the podium. You get an image of people being bad. Oh, this is the bad guy. Versus if showing them natural or maybe in a really nice setting, then suddenly they become the good guy. Regardless of what content they have, regardless of what their history is, all of a sudden they become the good guy, subconsciously in people's minds. Who is and isn't interviewed, what sources are used, and so forth. And also where the interview takes place. If I interview someone who's giving an opposing viewpoint to something, let's say we're talking about GMOs, and I don't use their quote until the end of the story, whereas I've the first part of the story, I've interviewed people that are in favor of GMOs, and at the end, oh yeah, GMOs have not been proven this or that. And it's at the end of the story, the people that wrote the story know that the vast, vast, vast majority of people are not going to read down to the last paragraph where that guy or woman is quoted. Okay, so where it's at, who's interviewed, what source. I can interview a source that's crazy, who supports a certain stand on something, or I can interview someone who's got a lot of credibility. Okay, so if I have a certain viewpoint and I have a certain bias, no matter who I am and no matter what newspaper, radio show, publication, I can choose who to quote, who to interview, and that changes all the context. I'm not going to do a story, even though you might have a story about what's going on with ISIS today. Most of the time, I probably would not quote Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein when they were warning, oh, well, if something happens in this country, this is what's going to happen. Well, both of them did say, well, this would be what happened, and it has happened. But probably I'm not going to quote them, okay? It's just not going to happen in the mainstream press. Again, image sells too. Take a look at who is actually presenting the story, like in the news, for instance. In America, especially, you're going to have a situation where you're going to have an older man who he's the expert, and a younger woman, the pretty face, usually blonde. And they're going to be the people that are going to be doing the daily news on your local station. You're going to choose these kind of cardboard cutout men to be the main anchors of the networks. Or you're going to have, like some of the networks do, you're going to have women who are, well, they're in their 30s, but they still look good in a miniskirt up there giving the news. This is all part of the image that then gets translated to the people. What do people want to watch? Do they want to watch an old elderly person doing the news, even though that elderly person might be the most intelligent person ever? Or are they going to deal with or are they going to deal with wanting to watch someone who has a lot of credibility, that has maybe less, they look credible, but they just have a degree in journalism or something else such as that. So ultimately, what you're going to find is that people are mostly judging the credibility of a news story based on the person, the person's view of the world and how that's reinforced through what they're seeing. So that, in other words, it's not good or bad. It's just reality that a person in America is going to have a totally different perception of what's going on in a country like Israel or what's going on in the Ukraine than a person, for instance, on the Ukraine issue, someone living in Russia, or on the Israeli issue, someone living in, Gaza or Israel itself. They're all going to have a different viewpoint because their interest and what they've grown up with and what they've seen as the reality is going to be totally different from the other person. Even countries as close culturally as Sweden and the United States, it's going to be a totally different context. It's going to be a different environment. that your news organization is working in. Now, that's not to say the news organization is without influencing the culture. They can't go too far. Okay, they can't go too far or they'll lose viewers. And that's true for alternative media too. You know, if you're right wing, you're not going to bring on a communist most of the time to speak. If you're a communist, you're not going to bring on someone's right wing to speak. That is the nature of how the media operates in that sense. But at the same time, every news source is going to have a certain bias. They can't help it. And again, it's going to be the words we use, the stories we choose to deal with, the stories that don't get dealt with, the experts we try to find, the stories we make a big deal about. That's what sets the agenda. That is what ultimately news is there and is doing. But going back to Chomsky, I think when I watched a conference where he was speaking, and he stated that probably he recognized all of this, but what he did say was the best thing to do is to choose several different sources and compare them in order to get a sense of what's true. When you do that, at least you've got that variety. And the internet today is giving us that ability. Younger people are getting their news. Younger, more educated people are getting their news and information off the internet. Older and less educated people are still relying on network news, whether you're living in, whatever country you're living in. It's easier just to sit there and munch on dinner and watch the news than it is to say, you know what? Obama or Putin or Levin or Cameron, they're saying this and this and this, but I want to see if that's the whole story. That takes a little bit more effort. That takes a little bit more critical thinking. And ultimately, that is what I think we need to have as a society, especially in this age where the computer is enabling not just getting news stories, but also being able to compare and also put on our own stories. You got a video camera, you got it in your cell phone even, you can post things, events and so forth, give commentary. You can set up a vlog or your own website, or you can do any number of things to reach people out there. So you can become part of the new media too. This is a new era where anyone that can afford a computer can they can do a podcast. They can send information out, even taking news stories and sharing them with people on your Facebook page. Although some people think that's kind of nerdy, it actually is something that's kind of, it's very important to get information out to people. And what was it that saying that, I think it was Kennedy, but it was also founding fathers that said you have to have a literate, well-informed population in order to really have democracy. And I know it was John F. Kennedy, who did say the weakest link in a democracy is the least informed person, because you need an informed citizenry to really have democracy work to benefit everyone and to keep a society safe from losing individual liberty and freedom of choice and so forth. Anyway, that's all for this show. I hope you enjoyed it. Maybe learned something. Share it with someone if you wish. Visit my website at michaelcross.net or my YouTube station at Michael Cross. Just type in Michael Cross into YouTube and it'll take you there. There's several there, but you'll see it's the one that deals with news and so forth. And anyway, well, I'll catch you later next week on another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV.